Good morning and welcome to the third episode of our podcast,
where we drink tea and navigate the balance between school and personal life.
I'm Sophia Safe.
And I'm Sophia Currie.
And this is Sip and Spill. Welcome to our first Tea Time Talks.
Basically, Tea Time Talks is an interview segment where we interview someone from our personal lives or someone else that we decide that can come on and join this segment to teach us all about what they have to say about a specific topic.
So today we have a very special guest joining us. She's actually my aunt and the person that helps me with all of my problems. Let's start with the introductions. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Aayesha. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I work with a variety of mental health issues, but one of my sort of niche specialties is I do outdoor therapy. I believe strongly in the healing power of the outdoors, as well as moving your body for your health. But I also believe strongly in healthy communication, which is a little bit of what we'll be talking about today.
Great. So today we want to ask you a little bit about conflict resolution. And so let's start off with our first question. Okay. So can you describe a recent situation where you experienced conflict and how did you handle it?
Yes, so I'm going to give you guys a bit of a doozy. This is a situation where I was actually traveling overseas with a friend for the first time. You guys are teens now, but you'll learn more as you get older. You definitely learn a lot about someone when you're traveling with them. And this was a case, pretty far into our travels and both a little bit tired. We've been driving across France, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and had sort of hit probably our 9 or 10 hour mark. We've been talking a lot, and I'm often a person this person leans on, and I don't as often lean on them, but on this trip I was doing a little bit more of that. And there came a point where the friend had basically said to me that the issues that I was bringing up was sort of killing their mood. And I found that very hard to accept. And so initially, I wouldn't even say I handled it incredibly well in terms of a professional point of view, but I think as a human, I handled it as humanly as I could, which is to say I got very upset and sort of stated that I needed to take a second to take in that information and sort of went quiet for a while. And eventually we just sort of decided to do our own thing for a few hours. But eventually we came back and had a long, sometimes loud discussion about it. But, we'll get into some of the details of how I managed the upset of that conflict, but I think it's really important to recognize, we have human natural reactions when upset, and it's very normal and appropriate to feel them, but just as important to also not villainize another person for having their feelings, even when upset by them.
Okay, so then what do you think were the underlying causes of the conflict you experienced?
And this is something I consider a lot when dealing with conflict. I think it was a conflict of needs. Essentially, this friend was feeling, and I came to this understanding after we had our discussion, but she was feeling emotionally burnt out. Like I said, it was far into our trip. We had been talking nonstop, both of us on and off about, heavy topics, light topics, and she had come to a burnout point and didn't realize it until she had said it. And I had a need to feel heard and seen in my, in dealing with my issues, as well as just sort of wanting a sounding board and understanding.
Okay, so how do you think, in terms of when you're going through this as a teenager, as an adult you have experience built up on how to deal with the situation, but teenagers often, parents are like, well, trust us because we have had more experience than you. So, in terms of teen issues and, working it out between them and, teachers, how do you think teens can properly handle a situation like that?
For sure. I love working with teens actually. They're some of my favorite populations because I like to say they're like raw nerves running around in the world. It's their first time really experiencing like big sad, big mad, and big upsets, like really the first time sort of conscious to the world and feeling those things. And so I think part of it is just giving yourself grace and and like I even said, I do that for myself as well, but for teens especially, understanding that it's your first time really sometimes feeling these big emotions. So understanding, the first time you feel something, it's going to hit so much harder because you don't know yet how to regulate. And so for me, both with parents and with teens, and I have to remind parents of this all the time because they're like, how can they not understand that what I'm saying is right? And it's like, how can they? They've only lived 16 years. They haven't learned enough yet to understand that you're right in this thing. And in that case, if they are right, of course, sometimes they're not. But a lot of times, parents have lived lives that have come to learn things that the teens haven't yet. But it's not something someone who hasn't lived it can understand. And so to me, honestly, these same tenets of conflict resolution and self-regulation are some of the ways that I think are really important. I think actually you guys talked about some of them last week about self-regulation, like the 5-4-3-2-1 method and box breathing and things like that, where those are for crisis management. And so if you're really feeling upset and you're out of your body, I think those are some really good tools. And essentially those come down to mindfulness techniques. And not to go, this is a little bit long, but not to go on about it, but I think it's really good information that when we say mindfulness, it actually sounds like you're in your mind, but really mindfulness is about being in your body. When you get stuck in your head, it's really easy to feel like something's the end of the world. One of my favorite quotes is, don't live in a future that hasn't come yet. So to make sure you're living in the now and allow yourself to deal with the problem as it is in this moment, rather than sort of getting wrapped up in what could be or even what was, and just being able to live in your body in this moment and not get stuck.
Okay, so speaking of like methods or strategies, when you think about like resolving conflicts, like in the moment, what methods or strategies do you usually use?
So one of my favorites, I've actually talked to you, Sophie, about this, about how nonviolent communication is one of my favorite methods of communication techniques. It's really clever and brilliant the way that it's very clear in how you're communicating. That's sort of the biggest point of it. It's about recognizing the needs of both people as equally as important and understanding what those are, as well as communicating in a way that's not judgmental, but is open. So, for example, people may have even heard the term I language or I statements versus you statements. So let's say if you're saying, you're so mean, right, to someone, they feel judged. They're like, well, what about this time I was nice and this time was this time I was nice. How can you say I'm mean, right? Instead, you can say something like, I felt so hurt when you called me that name, right? Because then you're pointing to something very specific that was done that you felt was mean, but when you call someone mean, they may feel judged as a person rather than understanding what went wrong or what they did that was hurtful. So I really like using nonviolent communication as a form of conflict resolution. Um, and I really think that something in particular that I love about it is that it allows for also the person who's speaking to be conscious about what they're saying. So both parties have to be involved in the conflict resolution.
Okay, so I think to touch more into that, when you personally are in the wrong and you don't really know what to do, how should one receive criticism or how should one give criticism in that situation so that the other person isn't hurt? Which I think you were touching on more. So how does the person in the wrong receive that?
Oof, it's always hard, I have to say. It's never easy, recognizing when, you do something wrong. It's really easy to fall into even just negative self-talk, things like that. Another thing, you guys will hear a lot of my sort of common phrases, but one of them, focusing on value-based decision-making versus outcome-based decision-making. So something I always recommend that everyone do is figure out what you stand for. So what are your values? What is important to you? How do you want to move in the world? And for me, some of my primary ones are honesty, loyalty, integrity. I have a whole list, but often if I feel like I did something wrong and I start to feel guilty, it's usually an indication that I've sort of trampled on one of my values. And so I really try to recognize what it is that I am not doing. We talk a lot about guilt and shame, and I feel like shame is not very helpful, while guilt can be data. So if I'm feeling guilty about something, and I know and I can recognize, for example, let's say, it was a friend's party and I forgot to get a gift, right? That is me not, a value set for me is caring for the people around me. And by not doing that, I felt guilty. And I think that was an appropriate thing for me to feel so that I could recognize, hey, wait, I didn't like that. And I don't want to be moving in the world like that. So I can reach out to them, apologize, or even just send the gift. I don't even necessarily need to apologize if the situation isn't appropriate. But in the situation you're asking, if someone brings their criticism to me, I think it's natural, depending on how it's stated, for someone to be defensive. But I also think it's really important that when it's someone you care about, someone whose opinion you respect and you think, has your best interest in mind, if they're bringing you an issue, I think it's a really good idea to hear them out and understand what is upsetting them and what needs they are expressing in that complaint or criticism.
So you just touched on needs for the both of you. So how do you balance your needs with the needs of others when you're working through a disagreement?
That's a really good question. I think it's a learning process is what I'd say. Usually we know our needs and we don't know the other person's needs, which is why we're upset. So I think building skills in communication is a big part of learning how to work through a disagreement. So, like I said in the last question, I think a big part of it is when we're upset, it's so easy to villainize the other person. They don't get me, they don't care about me, they don't want to know, they're just out to get me. And another phrase I like a lot is that don't attribute to malice what can be attributed to ignorance or selfishness. So it's pretty rare that people are being actively malicious. Malicious meaning sort of deliberately cruel. Most of the time, people are being maybe a little bit selfish, even accidentally, or they're ignorant to the impact of their behaviors. And so giving people the benefit of the doubt is something I like to do a lot. Again, I told you I'd give you a lot of phrases. Another one I love is moving with curiosity over judgment. It's really easy to be sort of again, this person is like this. They're just this way. Rather than moving with curiosity in a way, it would just be let me ask you why you did that. Can you tell me more about what got you here so that I can understand better? And that's sort of allowing room for their needs in that space.
Okay, so how do we get comfortable with confrontations, and what could help you as a person feel more confident in situations like that?
Great question. I think confrontations are rarely ever easy. I think, the expectation that it'll be a walk in the park is usually, I would say, should be emotionally prepared for a conversation that's hard potentially on both ends, but that doesn't mean it has to be difficult in a way that's insurmountable, right? So I would say, depending on even who I'm talking to, my ability, my comfort with confrontation is dependent on that person. and how much I feel like they're ready to have a hard conversation. Um, and I think that's probably what makes me feel most confident. If I know that I'm in this relationship for the long haul and this person's in this relationship for the long haul, I can usually trust that, okay, this person's willing to go the distance with me, and that even if we get to a hard place, even if it gets sticky, even if things are said that are even a little bit hurtful, we both understand that we both have good intentions in being here and never want to hurt the other person. I also do couples counseling, and something we talk about a lot is trust in communication with relationships. A lot of people assume that means something like loyalty, but it's or like I trust them to be honest, and it's actually not. What it means is I trust this person to have a benevolent perspective about me, meaning I trust that this person knows that I care about them and I don't want to hurt them and I actually want them to be happy. And so anything I'm saying is coming from a place of love and care. And I think when I'm going into a conversation with a person who I have that trust and confidence in, when I have that trust in, it's so much easier for me to be confident going into that conversation.
I like that a lot. So I think when a teen comes to you with like problems, with friends, because obviously social life is a huge thing in high school and it's hard to navigate. How do you help them like with the way you go about your treatment with dealing with like really hard situations? Because it's very easy, I think, even nowadays we see kids get into fights all the time. Like I feel like the world has gotten 20 times more violent. There's definitely statistics about this out there, I think I've seen. So how do you go about that, helping them?
Definitely. I think, you touch on such a real point. I think society has become so much more divided and conversations have become so much more divisive. Something that I feel so strongly about is people being, myself included, being more of a bridge in communications. Why I feel so strongly about it, because I think it's so often we're talking at odds and again feeling like enemies when really we're all just trying to be understood and heard. And so when I'm talking to my teens, something that I talk about almost immediately, and I was even not my teens, but my teens especially, is authenticity. I think teenage years is a time when being like everyone else or like sort of getting along, fitting in feels even more important than a lot of other ages. And so being authentic feels harder than ever because like, well, what if they won't like me? What if I'm not accepted? And I think that idea sort of sits in this idea that if I'm like them, they'll like me. But people are trained, from infancy, we're trained to understand and recognize when someone is being inauthentic or when they're faking it. I mean, you guys, your generation came up with try hard, I feel like, right?
Yeah.
So, where does that come from? It's from someone who's trying too hard and it's visible on them, even if they think they're killing it, right? It's just visible on them. And so authenticity is something I preach really highly. I say, like, once you're able to do it, it's like a superpower because you know who you are, you know your intentions, you know your values. And so when you're moving in the world and someone misunderstands you, you're like, oh, that's about you. That's not about me. And so you're better able to engage with what's happening. So, again, when I'm dealing with my teens, one of the biggest parts is I'm like, tell them how you feel, baby, let them know like that this hurt them. And again, like I'll pull in nonviolent communication where I help them craft their language in a way that's helpful to be understood. Sort of exactly like I was saying, let's say, there's a conflict in a relationship and it's like, how could you do this to me? You're so, like, that was so horrible of you, or like that was, so cruel or whatever that is, however it's said. Instead we say it in a much more specific way. That's like, I felt so disrespected when you laughed with that girl in front of me, and maybe that person, doesn't respond well, but the point is that you're getting your message across, and however they respond will tell you something about them and how they feel about your feelings.
So do you think authenticity comes with conflict?
It's a good question. I think it can. I think it depends on the conflict, right? So again, if it's two people who are like, you're bad, and it's like, no, you're bad. Or like, you're so mean. It's like, what about how all these times that you hurt me, right? I think we're rarely getting true authenticity in that environment. But ideally, I would say conflict can lead to a deepening of the relationship if it becomes collaboration, right? We keep talking about confrontation and conflict, but ideally these discussions or these conversations become collaborations between two people who care about each other, and the deeper you're able to go into a relationship where you're able to go through many conflicts, you can often deepen the relationship and have a much better understanding of each other than you did before the conflict. And so I definitely think a healthy collaboration and conflict can absolutely lead to authenticity and a better understanding of two people or however many people.
So, how do you think social media affects authenticity in terms of conflict or just in general?
It's another great question. Social media absolutely had such an effect. So, no, your listeners can't see me, but I'm a millennial. And so we came up in the advent of Instagram. And that is sort of like peak inauthentic interaction as far as I'm concerned. I've actually been off Instagram for probably going on 4 years now, just because I felt like personally the culture wasn't conducive to authenticity. And I think some people can do it really well and they can enjoy it without issue. But I do find that, these pictures, or even, on TikTok, these snippets of like, let's say 3 minutes, that's 3 minutes out of someone's life, and it's so easy to fake whatever it is that you want to in any moment. And I think, again, like, I have actually found TikTok to be much more authentic than an app like Instagram, where it's sort of like a highlight reel of your life. But I also think, many of us have been bamboozled with people on TikTok as well. I mean, I even say in real life, like, you get, like 3% of a person, even someone who you, let's say, know in school, right? You get only the version of themselves that they're bringing to school, but there's the whole version of themselves that exists outside of that. There's a theory, I don't know if it's a theory, but a perspective through Jungian psychology that deals with our four selves. It's, our self that we show the world, our self that we show, our close people, close family, close friends, our self that we show ourselves, and then our shadow selves that even we don't look at, right? And so it's really hard to do anything but show some of your best self when you're putting your video or picture out to thousands, potentially of millions of people. I don't want to sound like a pure hater, though. I will say I low-key am, but I do think, I think there's so many different ways to be a human in this world, and I'm just telling you mine. It's something that I feel very strongly about, that I always want to be able to change my mind, change my opinion, and with something like social media, there are many people who feel the absolute benefits, being able to connect with so many different people in the world. But if we're speaking about pure authenticity, I think it's definitely a place where people will not always show their real selves, but show their best selves.
So you touched on people having different opinions. So when someone is being stubborn with their opinion, how do you go about changing how you try and speak with them?
Oh, that's a good question. It depends on, what they're being stubborn about, for sure. But I would say I really try to move in the world in a way that's as non-judgmental as possible. So, like I was saying, there's so many different ways that people arrive at their opinions. I had my personal life experiences that all led me here, but someone else may have had a whole life of judgment and difficulty and situations that led them to believe that judgment is the right way to be, and for me to come to them and say everything you experience is wrong and this is what's right may not hit, right? And so for me, if someone is I of course always try to have a very clear and open-minded conversation. But if someone is sort of totally stuck on something that I fundamentally disagree with, as long as it's not, like anti-humanitarian, I will usually just understand that this person has had a set of different experiences from me and feels very strongly about their perspective, and usually just try to, sort of agree to disagree. I'll say that was much harder in my teens than it is for me now at my big age. But it's something that I do now feel very strongly about. Although, obviously, again, Steph, you know me personally, Sophia, we're getting to know each other a little bit better. I love a good debate. So if we're talking about a debate, then I will go all in and I will have a really fun and great time.
I don't know about great, but
having a in-depth discussion on our disagreements. But if it's a case where someone's feeling very strongly and feeling stubborn in their like life experiences, that's a case where you would usually just recognize that we disagree, and as long as it's, you know, like you can have your opinions and I can have mine, and that doesn't mean either of us are good or bad. Actually, again, like sort of we were speaking to the divisiveness and how distant people are these days in the world and how easily it's leading to creating enemies of each other. I think we should much more often understand that you can have different opinions and I can have different opinions, and that doesn't mean that we can't both be good people. I'll say even like a very hot take in today's society is that even politically, I think if you disagree with me, again, there are limits, but for the most part, mine are much broader than I found others to be. That I think if you disagree with me, even politically, and I know you to be a good, kind, caring person, I'm not suddenly going to decide, wow, you have this opinion, and so you must be a bad person. You must be, you know, a bigot or whatever it is. If it's not aligned with any other part of you that I know. But truly, I find that's a hot take. I can't usually say that one out loud.
Well, I actually agree with that because I kind of sit under the philosophy of I have a lot of different friends, like spanning different religions, different social views, different political views. Even my last, partner had very drastic political views sometimes that scared me, but, I knew them to be a good person, and these are good, loving people that I chose to be in my life because I like them. So I was like, yeah, I'm open to understanding that you have this point of view because of, certain experiences. But I think this can kind of segue into another question is, if you're a teen in a relationship and, and you have different opinions and the conflicts that can arise in a relationship, how should one move about navigating that, I guess?
Yeah, it's not easy. I will say, to your point, it's definitely complicated. And again, we're talking about teens here, but even in adulthood, I have couples in my office that are, decades of relationship and still deal with that same issue. And with teens, I would say, again, like I was saying, at the beginning, you guys are like raw nerves running around in the world. It's just like everything just feels like the biggest deal or biggest betrayal or biggest, and so to me, it's sort of, touches on a lot of what we were talking about today. It's about understanding where the other person is coming from and understanding that this person isn't out to get you. They're not trying to hurt you. They're also trying to communicate something. One of the skills that I think is really, excuse me, valued is listening. It's a skill that I think is incredibly important, and often people are listening to speak rather than listening to hear. And so really trying to hear what this person is trying to tell you and where they're coming from and what need they're trying to bring up when they tell you it, I think is really important. And I would say for the speaker, the same thing. Really trying to help the other person you're talking to understand the needs that are at play when you're communicating a thing and why you feel the way you do. I think can be really helpful when trying to resolve conflicts at any age, but especially when you're in your teenage years.
So I think another important question that I think is important for a lot of people to hear is, how should teens deal with their own internal conflicts? Because there's not just, conflict resolution isn't just about, your peers and the people around you, but yourself too.
Yeah, totally. So this is slightly, I would say adjacent to what we're talking about with conflict resolution between others, because to me, part of you're dealing with your internal conflicts is knowing yourself knowing what you need, knowing what feels good, and knowing how to self-regulate. This is sort of like maybe even silly to bring up here, but I always like to start with, people really underestimate what good sleep and eating correctly and being hydrated does also for the body. You guys are teens, and I know both of your schedules are heinous, and so sleep is usually a distant dream. But that is really underestimated, and it's something that I think more people should prioritize. So the basics of your own self-care are primary, is what I'd say first. Is you need to know that you're taking care of yourself so that you're in a good enough state to deal with what's ahead of you. So one, again, like I said, those are sometimes a distant dream, but that would be my first thing, is like get some sleep, eat a meal, take care of yourself. And then to me, I was saying early on, something I feel very strongly about is getting yourself outside and getting yourself moving. When we have feelings like anxiety, they release hormones in our body like adrenaline and norepinephrine, and those are activating hormones. So they want you to move, right? The original sort of concept is like when you come across, let's say, a tiger in the wild, fight or flight kicks in. So what does your body want to do? Either fight it or you're about to run, right? And so these are created in order to get you to be able to do those things. When you feel this intense anxiety at the idea of a test, those are now just sitting and circulating in your body. And so instead, what I'd want you guys to do is get moving, whether that's, gentle stretching for some people, that's going on a run for other people, that's taking yourself on a hike for other people. It is whatever works for you, I think is definitely is something you should be doing to get into your body. I was sort of mentioning this earlier as well. With anxiety, it's really easy to get stuck in the future. Like, oh my God, I'm going to fail. I failed this test, which means I'm going to fail this year, which means I'm going to not go to college, which means I'm going to be homeless in the street tomorrow, or, depression, where it's like, oh, I did this wrong thing. Why am I like this? I'm so awful. How could I be like this? Or, like I'm just so upset with myself, and you can get stuck in the past with depression, right? I'm simplifying it, but those are really easy ways to get stuck. And so instead, what I want you to do is consciously be present in your body in this moment. And by taking yourself outside or going into stretch or, even going and calling a friend, I'd say is another really good way. I think it's really important to lean on your people, know who your people are and call them. Let them, talk you off the ledge, so to speak. Again, I mean that lightly. But being able to know who you can go to and lean on them when you are upset, so that you can help release some of that tension and get the validation that you definitely need to be reminded that, okay, no, we're good. Everything isn't exploding. I think is another really good way to take care of yourself. And I think, spirituality can be really helpful. That can look like religion, but I also think that can look like nature. I think, the understanding that something I love about, yes, I'm going to geek out on you guys a little bit because, again, I do love the outdoors. And something I love about nature is the cyclical process of it, right? There's spring, new life, summer, it's bright, full of heat and, again, like the sort of exuberance of life. We go into fall where things start getting a little bit more gray, and then we go into winter where things die, and then we do that again and again and again. And I think it's a really good reminder of the way that all things are cyclical. Even when we feel stuck, it's rarely going to stay that way. And so you can have the trust that, okay, it's like this right now, but it won't be like this forever.
I like that a lot. So I think that's basically it in terms of our questions for you. And we really appreciate you coming to talk to us. And I think the main takeaway would probably be like, when you're dealing with people, be open to what they have to say, and take it as if you're in the wrong, kind of be open to that and say, hey, I messed up, but also like, know where your boundaries and your needs lie from other people when you're having those conversations, and what your needs of yourself are when you're taking care of yourself.
And in terms of need of yourself, make sure to be authentic and not have that herd mentality that you need to be like everyone else.
So especially with social media and all the pressures of today.
Totally. You guys are picking up what I'm putting down. And you make a really good point about boundaries too. It is really important to know, again, this is in knowing your needs, right? So if someone is stepping on your boundaries, like speaking to you with disrespect, something I do with people around me, I'm like, who are you talking to? Because I know it's not me if you're speaking to me with disrespect. And some people, have different levels of that, but it is also very important to know your boundaries.
Okay, I think that wraps up Tea Time Talks. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you for having me. This is incredible. I'm really proud of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today we have another very special guest joining us. Like Sophia, I have a special family member, my mom, who helps me with all my problems. Let's start with some introductions. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Marifel Estrada-Currie. I'm Sophia's mom. I'm so excited to be here just to talk about some of the questions you guys are going to ask me. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I've worked in so many different environments, and I've worked with teens and adolescents in the hospital inpatient setting, as well as in the outpatient setting and in the college counseling center. I'm currently in private practice, and I am specifically working with young adults as well as older adults, just to talk about their mood and depression and anything that comes up for them.
Okay, great. So to stick with our theme, we want to ask you a little bit about internal conflict resolution. Our first question is, can you think of a time when you've had an internal conflict, and how did you manage it?
Well, there have been tons of times, I think, for anybody where they've had several internal conflicts, but the one in particular that was a huge internal conflict for me was whether or not I was able to have a child and to be a mom. So the backstory, which I will be so candid about, I currently have a physical disability, and I had gotten sick when I was a baby in the Philippines with polio. So moving forward, long story short, we moved to the States. I got married, and my biggest concern was, despite my disability, as a result of my disability, rather, how would I, one, be able to carry a baby, and two, would I be able to take care of this child adequately enough as a result of my physical disability? So that was a huge internal conflict for me, because I truly did want to be a mother and I wanted to have children. But of course, my concerns were physically, would I be able to do it?
Okay, so how did you learn to manage that?
It was hard. I thought about all the things that I had already gone through that were obstacles in my life, but I chose to say, okay, what are the steps that are necessary in order to achieve something I really wanted? And was it reasonable? So I talked to several doctors, and I asked them, their opinions in regards to carrying a baby. And there really was no reason as to why I wouldn't be able to do that. It was just whether or not I'd be physically strong enough to go ahead. And I thought to myself, the only way I was going to find out was if I actually just took a chance, and whatever came across my path, obstacle or otherwise, I trusted myself and believed in myself that I would be able to do it, because I've already been able to do so much prior to that. So that was the first thing that I had to kind of come to terms with, was the fact that I am willing to do this, and I'm also willing to deal with any obstacles that might come before me. Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of also kind of comes across as almost an external conflict as well. So, how would you handle an internal conflict that results from external conflicts, whether it be like a fight with a friend that you felt, oh gosh, I hurt my friend, now I feel badly internally. How would you kind of handle something like that?
Oh, that's a really challenging question. Okay. So external conflict, like if I had an argument with a friend,
Yeah.
That's hard because I've had many. I'm thinking of one in particular that was a really hard one. She's a very good friend, but I think as a result of some of her behaviors, they weren't the healthiest, but I still wanted to maintain that relationship. But at the end of the day, I needed to think about what was healthiest for me and what would help me move forward. And as much as I wanted that relationship, I also needed to think about myself and my self care, and do what was necessary to, at the end of the day, end this relationship. So I needed to set really clear boundaries. I needed to remember what was important to me and what was keeping me from moving forward. And then assertively having to say to this individual that we needed to kind of move apart, kindly, of course, and that's kind of where it led. So I think it's important to remember what we as individuals need and what's getting in our way, and the importance of being assertive and setting those limits. And sometimes in doing so, we lose some things, but there's so much more to gain as well.
I agree. So, if, a teenager was doing this, because, in high school, these are huge, like, huge things that we have to go through as teens, especially in peer relationships and stuff like that. And we've definitely talked about this on our podcast before.
Mm-hmm.
From a mental health professional perspective, what would you say to a teen if, they went through your situation where they were like, I need to move apart from this friend? How would you help them manage internally, like kind of the grieving process of losing somebody that was important to them, them probably feeling guilty about things they might have done? How would you kind of help them through that?
Well, I think the first thing is you want to acknowledge their feelings, because ending any type of relationship or doing anything that potentially is a change for them, there's going to be emotions that arise, and they're going to be really hard, even if making that choice to end a friendship or a relationship is a really, really hard one because you've established a history with them. But, as you know, people grow apart. They were a part of your life for a reason when it was good, and then things happen and people need to move forward. So I think the first thing one I would want to do for them is say, what is that like for you? What are you feeling right now? And go through those feelings and process that for them. And then talk about, in making the decision to leave this friendship or relationship, um, the real reasons as to why they think for themselves they need to do that. Is it helping them? What are they losing as a result of staying in this relationship? What are they no longer getting? And if they can see themselves moving away from that despite the pain, what do they feel if they're able to identify that? What do they feel they're going to be able to gain despite saying goodbye? So saying goodbye to anything, any change is just difficult. Um, so it's just really important during that time as well to get as much support, because sometimes we can't think objectively. And so we go to the individuals that in our lives, and hopefully that's your parents, and sometimes it's not, because kids or teens rather, they relate to their peers, but you want to really think about those individuals that are looking out for your better good, that are the most consistent and can be honest with you and not just tell you what you want to hear. And at the end of the day, hopefully one is able to make that decision to move forward, um, and the relationship or the friendship if they need to. And time heals all things. So with that, they'll begin to understand later on that this, as hard as it was the right thing to do for them. But that's going to take time. Emotions have a way of really being overwhelming, and oftentimes they can confuse us into making decisions at the moment that probably aren't the best. So it's important to kind of get that support from other people, to regulate your emotions, most importantly. And I say this to you, my daughter, as well as to the clients I work with, take care of yourself. Self-care is one of the most important things you can do for yourself, but also for the people that you love. If you don't take care of yourself, then it's going to be hard to kind of give back to those that you want to give back to, or hold on to those relationships that are truly, truly healthy, because then we can't think objectively, you know. So yeah, so that's what I would say to them. But be mindful and kind and give yourself grace, because the emotions can be very, very overwhelming, especially when you're a teen.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true, and I definitely think as teens today, there's with so much pressure from so many different angles, and it being, you know, different from when you guys grown up, and there's just external pressures from social media, and just everybody's all of a sudden a superstar. How do you think, or not how do you think, but what is your perspective on how teens handle their like personal conflicts today? You know, whether it be healthy or not healthy.
It's so hard because when I was growing up, we didn't even have a cell phone. Our phones were connected to the walls. There was no social media. It wasn't so easily accessible. If we saw anything, I think our social, or not our social media, but our media was really through magazines. And what we saw in celebrities, or if anything, what we saw when we went to school. So all of those things still exist, but I think for teenagers, adolescents, and even adults today, social media is just at our fingertips. And so even when we're going to bed, right, which isn't the best thing to do, right? We want to put down that phone. It is constantly in our face. So I can't even imagine for you guys at this time how difficult it is and challenging it is to navigate that, because it isn't just what we see in school, it's what we see on the internet, which oftentimes isn't always accurate. People can say they're doing something, but in the background, they're really not. But the individuals that are viewing it, they just see what they see on the screen, which oftentimes they tell my young adults and adolescents, if I work with them, or my parents, what you see isn't always so accurate. So remember that it's only on a screen. So in terms of how I think teens handle it, I mean, I hesitate to say that oftentimes it might not be for the healthiest reasons. When one is overly emotional or wanting to be a part of a peer group, I think teens, and Sophia, you can confirm this or not, do very impulsive things, and they react as a result of the influence that they're having on from their friends. So that may be drugs or alcohol, or bullying, or just to be a part of a crowd, or changing themselves and doing things that they typically may not have done because they want to feel so connected. But to normalize it as an adolescent, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find our identity. So in doing so, we do whatever we can to feel connected. But what's important is that we go to those individuals that are healthy, our parents, our teachers, a therapist, and say, talk about those things that are difficult, and how are other ways of feeling connected, most importantly to oneself. What helps you feel like you're worthy, as opposed to having to go to their friends and get that worth from them. So connecting with the things that you love, music, art, really good stable friends that make really good choices, because we want to be really mindful of our impulsive decisions that we make on the fly. So that might be the struggles. The better ways of handling it, again, it goes back to the basics: self-care, having a good relationship, hopefully, with those individuals, and it may or may not be your parents, that you feel also make really good decisions. Being a part of a support group, or a group at school that you feel you're able to identify with and be yourself and not have to change who you are. Emotional regulation is another big, huge thing. How can we just take a breath? Breathing is one of the most essential things that we do. And when we are in that state of anxiety, we're what we call, professionals call, which you guys might know, fight or flight. And when we're in fight or flight, we're in this state where we sometimes do things that are impulsive. So, one of the easiest and best ways that you can manage that anxiety is just to regulate your breathing. Take a moment to emotionally reset, take a few breaths, be mindful of what's going on so that your brain can make logical decisions. And if you're not sure, you go back to whether it's an adult or a person that you're able to feel most comfortable with, a peer that you understand cares for you and looks out for your well-being, to make better and logical decisions so that you're able to manage your internal conflicts or external conflicts appropriately.
I definitely agree with that. And I definitely, Sophia's aunt was touching on a lot of these things. And, one of the things she also talked about was, you know, social media and that aspect, and how you were seeing a lot of kids want to fit in and change their personalities. And one of the big things she said was authenticity.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
Your take on that. So, what would your take be on, authenticity? How do teens get in touch with, becoming their authentic version of themselves and not really falling into the traps of, what social media can lead and peer pressure can lead to? And
Mm-hmm.
how can this help their internal conflicts by relying on authenticity?
Well, to be authentic means, in my mind, to be your true self. So, how can one be their true self so they can make decisions that they know, or hopefully they were taught to do, that's based on themselves and not the pressure of other kids? So, what I might say is reduce your social media. If you are allowed or your parents are okay with you having it, that's fine. But think about how much time you spend on it and whether or not that's really helping you to get in touch with the things that you love or the things that you think other people love that you feel you need to gravitate towards. So, social media in regards to reducing your media exposure is a huge thing. Getting in touch with the things that you yourself really love to do, whether it's music, an instrument, dance. When you understand yourself better, it'll give you more of an ability to be able to then gravitate to those other individuals, hopefully, that also have uh, similar likings or similar activities. Because with that, then I think that touches upon more of your authentic self. So really reduce that social media. What else? Think about what's important to you. And when you're not around your friends, ask yourself, who else agrees with some of the things that I agree with? And then and think about that. Your friends and the choices you make uh, are huge influences on the decisions that we do and how to be our authentic self. If your gut feeling is saying this doesn't feel right to me, then we want to take a minute to step back and really ask ourselves, what is that about?
Okay, so what are some internal conflicts that you see are very common with teens?
Internal conflicts. Um, Whether or not they're making the right decision and moving forward with college, the classes that they're taking. I don't know. You guys tell me.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as an adolescent?
I think one of the very common ones is, especially nowadays with social media and how much information we can get, it could be, it's very self-worth based because of
Okay.
how competitive I think
Yes.
everything is. Everything now, I know, especially for me at school, being in a giant school with like 3,000 kids is really intense because the people around you, I know you've told me this growing up, is when you get to high school, you're going to be surrounded by your peers who are, just as smart as you. You'll no longer be the smartest one anymore, or you'll no longer be the best violin player. You may no longer be the best sports player. And I think that's something that's really hard for a lot of kids to grapple with is, you know, oh my gosh, I'm no longer the best one here. And then, self-worth based, like, wow, gosh, what do I do? Like, maybe I'm not as great as everyone says I am, or I thought myself to be, or, it could be body image. And Photoshop and all that is so common on social media, how, like,
It is
all of a
hard.
sudden you don't feel like you're skinny enough, or, you're too skinny, or everything's nitpicked apart.
Right.
So, like, I think those are really common ones. So, how do you think, teens can properly manage these internal conflicts?
Well, I've always said to you, there will always, and people may not always agree with me, there's always going to be somebody that's better or not as good as you. Whether you're at the top of your class, it will change and it will fluctuate. So how does one measure themselves? Because the only thing we have control over is how we choose to react and respond to a situation. We don't have control over what's going to fall in front of us, who is going to be better, or who is not going to be as good. We have control over how we choose to see ourselves as opposed to how the world sees us. Because the world will constantly see us in different ways. And so I think one of the things to remember is how to turn down the volume on other people's opinions, and know that maybe the measure of how we view ourselves is, are we doing our best, which is a hard thing. And if we are doing our best, that is enough. And that's a really hard thing to think about when we're constantly bombarded with other people's accomplishments. But I don't know, I think the best advice I could give somebody is those accomplishments that we see with other people, they're going to ebb and flow, and there's going to be somebody that's better. And so it's too much work to have to try to maintain somebody else's accomplishments in comparison to our own, if that's what makes sense. I think there's a lot of self-love that has to go with that. I always say to you, love yourself for the things that you don't like as much, or find acceptance in the things that you don't like as much, but also in the things that you truly love about yourself. So self-acceptance is a huge part of, internal conflict and measuring that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something a lot of teens struggle with, and that's really hard. But I think that basically wraps up all of our questions for
Okay.
today. So, I think the main takeaway would be, in terms of internal conflict, we really make sure to stay true to ourselves and, pick the right friends, make sure your influences around you are what align with what you want. And when you go through something major like losing a friend, or a breakup with a partner, you take the time to sit down and realize what you need, and realize that it's not your fault. And yeah, I think that's basically it. I mean, do you have anything else you want to add?
I would say give yourself grace.
Mm-hmm.
Take risks and don't worry so much, even though it's easier said than done, about what other people are going to think. Take risks and know that it is okay to make mistakes. It is okay not to be the best. It is okay, because if you see that then you'll realize how human you are. And to be human also means to love the things that you're so grateful for, and to accept the things that you're not. And there's always room for improvement, but give yourself grace. We don't have to live to anybody else's expectations but our own, and set your own expectations realistically, because we're all still growing. God knows, as much as I've been through, and being in my career as a licensed psychologist, I'm still growing, and I don't know half as much as I would like to know. But my biggest teachers are the individuals that I work with and my children. And I always say to you guys, If I'm doing something wrong, because I will, tell me, because I'm learning from that. My measure is not to be somebody that's perfect, and I would never want that for any teen or for you. Just be you, because you are good enough. You're worthy enough, with or without the perfection. There is no perfection, really.
Okay, yeah, I think that was really great. So I think this wraps up our second Tea
Okay,
Time Talks.
thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for joining
Of
us today. It was a
course.
pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for listening to our third episode. I hope you'll join us here next week on Sip and Spill.